Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I have a very different episode today, but a very exciting one. This is my first ever interview podcast, and I thought no better place to start than with a historian who has covered the birth of professional rodeo and also has plenty of books about each of the different events that you'll find at a rodeo. So I'm very excited to introduce to y'all today Miss Gail Hughbanks Woerner. But before we get into that, I want to say thank you to everyone who has started listening to the show more recently. If you haven't gone back and listened to all my earlier episodes, one of the best things about doing a history podcast is that they never really get outdated. They're not about current events, they're about history. So I would encourage you to go back and listen to those. And also give me a follow on Instagram at The Rancher Podcast. I'm actually going to be giving away a copy of Miss Woerner's book that I am going to talk to her quite a bit about. The book is called The Cowboy Turtles Association, and it's a great book if you want to know more about the history of rodeo. And so if you want to enter that giveaway, I will be posting the contest rules on that on my Instagram page. So please go ahead and go give me a follow over there and look for that. But for now, let's get started with a quick introduction on Miss Woerner, and then we'll get into the interview. So Gail Woerner was born and raised on a ranch in northeastern Colorado and worked with cattle and broke horses with her grandfather. She has written 5 books on the history of rodeo, a children's book on rodeo, and numerous articles in various Western-related magazines and periodicals, including magazines in France, Canada, and Australia. Gail is the chairman of the Oral History Project for the Rodeo Historical Society and interviews senior cowboys and cowgirls and those being inducted into the Society's Hall of Fame. These videos and vocal recordings are housed in the archives of the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Gail is the chairman of the Rodeo Clown Reunion, which is held at various rodeos across the nation and generally has 40 retired laugh getters, bullfighters, and barrelmen attend. They don their familiar makeup and costumes and sign autographs and entertain the fans. She also writes a newsletter to numerous retired rodeo clowns and their widows monthly. She has received the Academy of Western Artists Will Rogers Medallion Award for Western Nonfiction for her book entitled Rope to Win, The History of Steer, Calf, and Team Roping, which she wrote in 2008. And she's received the American Cowboy Culture Award from Western Riding at the National Cowboy Symposium held in Lubbock, Texas in 2009. And she has received the Western Heritage Award at the Texas Rodeo Cowboy Hall of Fame in 2012. Gail lives near Austin, Texas with her husband Cliff. So I'm really excited to get into this interview. And like I said, please go follow me on Instagram if you'd like to get a free copy of this book. We'll be running the contest on there through the next month. But you know, Miss Woerner, or Gail as she told me to call her, is a fantastic storyteller and just is a wealth of information on the early years of rodeo. So please join me in welcoming Miss Gail Woerner, and we will get right into it after a quick word from our sponsors. So, Ms. Woerner, welcome to the program, and thank you for coming on the Rancher today. I brought you on because in my second ever episode, I talked about the history of the National Finals Rodeo, and of course that dovetails quite a bit with your book, The Cowboy Turtles Association, which I actually said in the podcast that I was going to do an episode on. And when I started researching it, that's how I stumbled upon your books and thought, instead of me trying to give this history, why don't I go to somebody who's a subject matter expert? So thank you for being on today.
I appreciate it, and fire away. I'll answer if I can.
Great. Well, I think the first place that I'd like to start is what actually got you interested in writing on the history of rodeo? Because I know from your bio, you grew up on a working ranch, and I did as well. But, not everyone that grows up on a ranch grows up to document that history. So what kind of drove you to try and preserve the Western way of life?
Well, let me first of all say that wasn't a plan in the beginning. I had written a book called my first book and published it myself called Willard, Colorado, A Special Place in Time. That was my hometown. And although it didn't make it, and it's one of the towns built by the railroad that didn't make it for homesteaders because progress killed it, I wrote this book, and I wanted to do a second one because I enjoyed the process. I had an acquaintance, George Doak, who told me he had retired as a rodeo clown, and I asked him if he knew what the history was, how it got started, and he didn't. He didn't know a thing about it. So looking for a second subject to write on after I had written about my home community, I found nothing. I went to libraries and looked for history of the rodeo clown, could find nothing. And I decided this might be something that I could really get involved in. And actually, it took me 6 years to get it published. Not to get it published, but to get the book finished so I could get it published. I found absolutely nothing on the history of the rodeo clown that had ever been written, and I didn't find a single rodeo clown that knew anything about the history. So I decided that was a good subject for me to tackle, and it was a lot of fun, and that's how I got started.
Well, I think that unfortunately that story is one that I've come across as well, is that I find that there are so many aspects of Western history that just really there's not a lot of stuff known about it anymore. I mean, I've tried to do a few podcasts on some horses that people consider the foundations of, horses in America, horses like Steel Dust. And when you start looking for details on those horses, there's just not much. And so that's kind of what drove me to start this podcast, was trying to preserve those stories. So it sounds like that's what got you involved as well.
Well, I certainly had very little background on starting it. I grew up going to rodeos as a kid. My grandfather was an old cowboy, and my dad didn't want to have anything to do with it, but they loved the horse races. They loved going to Cheyenne. They loved going to Denver to the National Western Stock Show and Rodeo. And therefore, that's how I got started. And, of course, all the local rodeos. And my grandfather, I spent a lot of time with him because I was an only child. And we both had, my parents and my grandparents had houses on the ranch. And I was with him more than I was with anybody else in my family. And it didn't matter what gender I was. I was his only grandchild. And so he entered me in kids walk, trot, and canter your horse and get a ribbon on a horse I'd never seen before. And he made me train my own mare's colts. And I just grew up watching rodeos and going to that. And my school was so little, they played six-man football in high school, and that's not very exciting. So I got very interested in rodeo, but then I grew up and got what I called citified for a while. And it took me a while to get back to where my roots and my good qualities all came from the ranch. And that's kind of how I got started in writing.
Well, it's great to know that you were able to connect to your grandfather through rodeo. I think that's something that a lot of people, regardless of where they live, we're only a few generations removed from basically everyone in America growing up on a farm, and so I think a lot of people connected with their grandparents that way. So that's a great story. Now, the main reason, like I said, that I wanted to have you on, and we'll get into how you sourced this book, because again, it had to have been quite the monumental task to hunt down a lot of this information. But I wanted to talk about the beginning of rodeo as an organized sport, and of course the Cowboys Turtle Association. So, as I understand it, rodeo is truly a Western American invention. I mean, this didn't really happen anywhere else, and it came out of the 19th century. So, can you give me just a quick little overview about where rodeo started? I mean, we talk about Prescott, Arizona being one of the first, but even that's kind of disputed. So, what is the quick digest of how rodeo started?
Well, the quick digest of how rodeo started is we're never going to know when the first one was. They can all say that this was the first one because they charged a fee to see it, and there's all kinds of things that historians have determined what really had to happen there to be the first rodeo. And I don't want to get into that because I don't really think we're ever going to know. I think it depends on in those days, on ranches, on farms. There weren't many days off, and I'm talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s. 4th of July was a day that everybody tried to rest. An occasional Sunday in a farming or ranching community, and all the people in that community got together, and even the cowboys that worked on the ranch. Now, I will say, first of all, cowboys are fellas that work with cattle and horses. It started, I know we had vaqueros and caballeros in Mexico. I don't know a whole lot about dates and things like that, about what happened in Mexico. I do know that the Hawaiians invited the vaqueros over to try to help them control the cattle operation over there, because people that came to the islands very early brought cattle, and they became a menace, and they had no way of controlling them, and they were just wreaking havoc. But in the United States, cowboys were really not mentioned until after the Civil War, 1865. And at that time, the East was starving to death for beef. And some very creative people, ranchers in the Texas area, gathered up the longhorns that had been running wild and trailed them up to a railhead, which was either in Kansas. There were several in Kansas and other various areas, just so they could send these wild cattle back to the east so they could have some beef. And at that time, I must say that if you own a ranch, you're a rancher. If you're working cattle for that rancher, you're a cowboy. If you're riding broncs or breaking horses, you're a cowboy. So the vaqueros and caballeros in the United States were all called cowboys. And this all started after 1865, and from there it just kind of happened. But these community things might be, everybody brings something to eat. They get a little shade tree somewhere, and everybody congregate, and they may even do a little ball game in the afternoon for the guys. The ladies would sit around and tell about what's been happening in the community, and the fellas would have a ball game, and maybe somebody talk about a cowboy that was the best cowboy in the community, and somebody disagreed with him. And pretty soon you had somebody going back to the ranch, bringing a horse over, and they had little competition between two cowboys. That's one way it started. Another that would be a town that decided they needed some kind of an affair to bring everybody together, and they may rope off the downtown area and have a little roping. They may have a horse race. It all started with what cowboys did for a living, to make a living. And nobody, I think, thought anything about it becoming what it is today. But it was just a way of entertaining and a way of competing against one another. And because cowboy life out on the ranch could be very boring. You may be assigned to go with a herd of cattle up into one particular pasture way up in the hills somewhere. You may not see another person for another month or two. And it fits some cowboys' personalities and attitudes, but some of them, they liked people. They liked going places. They liked competing. And that's how it all started. But there was no uniformity to it at all in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Have I answered your question?
For sure, yes. And, I talked about the Chisholm Trail in an earlier episode, and what you bring up is a great point. I mean, these guys were out on the range, and one of the things that I've always found so unique about rodeo is that, whether it's baseball or football or basketball, those are sports, but they have no translation to the working world. Your ability to, shoot baskets is not something that translates to your ability to enter spreadsheets or whatever else. Whereas your ability to rope a calf and whatnot is pretty close to what you do every day on a ranch. And so I always found it interesting that, this type of competition came out of what these guys were doing every day, day in and day out. And I'm sure that a lot of them were quite the hands because, they were essentially practicing all day, every day, weren't they?
Exactly. Well, what it was is exactly what they were being hired to do by the rancher. He might have hired one cowboy to break the horses and to ride, so they would have additional horses because a cowboy could use as many as 2 or 3 horses a day if he really was working with a big herd or something that required him actively on a horse all day long. But you're absolutely right. This was everybody that was in rodeo in the beginning was a cowboy. They were not acting, they weren't doctors and lawyers or city people that had hardware stores and what have you, and good horsemen too. They made their living, and their living was very, very meager. Because usually on a ranch, they provided a place to stay, a bunkhouse, or some place to sleep and food. And so some of the times when they happened to get in one of these little matches and got maybe a little build up of money to win, they may win as much as they made all month on the ranch.
Yeah.
It didn't really set real well with the ranchers, actually.
Yes, ma'am. And I think what you're talking about is something that will probably play into the beginning of rodeo, and we actually saw this in other professional sports as well, is that there's a major class difference. You brought up that if you owned the ranch, you were a rancher, but if you were the one working the cattle, then you were a cowboy. And I think that, we'll touch on this later, but in golf, people like Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer, when they first started competing at the professional level, the country club class, if you will, kind of looked down their noses on them as, they were these traveling athletes that kind of lived out of their cars, and they just weren't the moneyed class. And I think that, that's probably what led to some of the difficulties in getting proper pay and judges at the beginning of rodeo. So, if you wouldn't mind, why was there a need for the Cowboys Turtle Association? We'll get into the name here in a minute, but from what I understand, you needed standardization of prizes and judges. Those were the big issues, right?
Right, but I'm gonna back up a little bit and say something that follows up with what you just said about other sports.
Mm-hmm.
And the class distinction of people is that were the competitors in rodeo versus the people who put on rodeos. Now, the Rodeo Association of America was the first organization of any kind that was put together, and it was put together by businessmen, men that were on rodeo committees or producers that decided that they should have, that when they started making people pay to see it. It started out in all kinds of different ways. In fact, there were 2 brothers that were out in New Mexico, and they were headed home to Texas, and they had a herd of cattle. and that herd of horses. And they had gotten these horses, were given to them instead of money to pay for what they'd done out there. So they were taking them home, and they weren't broke. So every time they'd stop in a little town and get them in a corral, and they get to ride them to go toward breaking them, and they collect a crowd. And after they'd done this to a few little towns, they got the bright idea to charge 25 cents to everybody, and that was going to come and see, and they paid it. And that is kind of the evolution of early day rodeo, is how, why can't we just sit and watch? Well, it's something that not everybody can do. And so that is a story that is in one of my books. But anyway, that led to the first producers. And then the first producers, when they first started seeing that maybe the rodeo lasted way too long, they stopped to revive cowboys. They stopped to fix a piece of. They didn't use chutes in the early days, but they had some little work to do. And the producer that was putting it on and making the money saw his audience start to wander off because they lost interest in it, and that's how the rodeo clown even got started. And he just grabbed a cowboy and said, "You do something. Get out there in front of all the guys, and I'll pay you a little money if you'll get them to pay attention instead of get up and leave." So the whole evolution was not planned out, but the Rodeo Association of America started with attorneys and people of education that put on the rodeos, the businessmen, and it started having more unified rodeos that had bronc riding, had roping. I talked to some early cowboys that said that they rode their horse 30, 40 miles to a rodeo, and when they got there, they didn't have the event that they were good at. And that happened in early rodeo. It wasn't all the same events being held.
Mm-hmm.
And so this organization came along and put some rules together, but it didn't give the cowboys any say. And none of the producers ever put their entry fee. And for anybody who is not familiar with rodeo, a rodeo is a competition. A rodeo is not an exhibition. A rodeo is a competition. And as a competition, everybody that competes has to pay an entry fee, but the producers kept the entry fees and never put it in the purse, the amount of money that the cowboy was going to win. And so because of that, the cowboys always thought, from the very beginning, well, why don't you put the our entry fee in the purse? And they weren't making these purses big enough that the cowboys were really winning a lot of money. And this went on for quite some time. The earliest organization effort toward cowboys to do anything goes back to 1915. And cowboys got together at a rodeo and talked about what they weren't getting, and the money needed to be more and all, and they formed an organization. And then after the rodeo, they all scattered, went different places, different directions, and a lot of them didn't see each other for another year. And so that organization was planned and fell apart before it ever got started. And the cowboys kept complaining and complaining because they wanted that entry fee as part of the purse and more money in the purse. And another problem that they had was that a lot of these producers would have the local sheriff, maybe the local doctor, somebody that was respected as a judge, and his ability to judge a good bronc ride or a good roping or whatever was not to the cowboy that did it as a living, rodeo as a living, or going around to different rodeos. And they felt that the judging was kind of bad at certain times, especially when the local cowboy that wasn't as proficient at his skill as they were always won. When the local, doctor or local sheriff decided who did the best. And
we always called that home cooking in sports when I was growing up. You'd get there and the referee would be against you from the beginning. We'd always say, "Oh, there's some home cooking going on with that ref."
Mark Clinton was an old bronc rider, and he lived to be 102. And I used to call him a lot for reference of getting information about the horses. He knew every bronc in his era. And he was in the Casey Tibbs era from, say, the 40s up through the 50s and 60s. And I called him, and he told me that he knew I was from northeastern Colorado. And he said, "I was in your hometown, and I won the bronc riding. I won the all-round at the rodeo in Sterling." And he said, "I was in my pickup, and I was leaving." And he said, "Here came the main guy out waving at me, and I rolled my window down, and I said, 'What happened?' And he said, 'Well, we refigured, and you didn't win.'" And he said, "Who did win?" And it was a local guy. He said, "I reached around in the back of my pickup," and he said, "I picked up that saddle, threw it out on the ground, and just drove off." And in later times, he said, "I probably won some I shouldn't have, and I probably didn't win some I should have." And that was his attitude about the early days. They wanted better qualified judges. So the Cowboy, I'm going to go back to 1935.
Okay, and I did want to touch on, you said that a really interesting thing to me and a very important thing that you said was that rodeo is a competition, not an exhibition. And, it seems to me as you get into the story about the CTA that if these cowboys hadn't organized, the rodeo we see today would probably look a lot more like a Buffalo Bill exhibition or a circus, where these men were just performers and not competitors. So I just wanted to make sure, that I felt that was a very important thing that you said, and delineating that this is a competition and it is a sport. And it's probably thanks to these brave cowboys. So we'll get into the CTA now, but I just wanted to point that out for our listeners that it wasn't always predetermined that it was going to be that way, right?
Well, absolutely not. And it was just kind of make it up as you went along. But things happen in anything that you're starting at the beginning. You find out that this works and this doesn't work, and what. And so they needed more organization, and they needed those businessmen in a way. But cowboys are very independent, and cowboys are, you get two or three cowboys together, and you're going to get three different opinions. You get two or three ranchers together, and you're going to get different opinions on what they should do. But anyway, because of this, I want to say one thing. Wild West was blowing and going before rodeo really got started. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people didn't understand the difference. And the difference is Wild West, all the performers were all promised a salary. Very few got what they were promised, but they went out. Buffalo Bill was one of the big ones, Pawnee Bill. They took them east and showed what was happening in the West, supposedly. But it was bronc riding, it was roping, but they may even have a little scenario where they were fighting Indians or they were fighting one another, rustlers or what have you. But everybody was paid. And there were some cowboys in those early days when Wild West was still going on that would go to a Wild West because they honed their skills by being with the Wild West show. And they got better at bronc riding, at roping, at steer wrestling, whatever it was that they were interested in. But when they got good enough, they always went back to rodeo because it was a competition, and that's what they wanted to do. And so that is the difference between Wild West shows and rodeo. Rodeo is always a competition. You have to pay to play, and if you're not good enough, you go home empty-handed.
Well, that's a great way to put it. So let's go back to 1935.
Okay, in 1935, Now, keep in mind, these top cowboys were the ones that were really unhappy with what was going on because they weren't making enough money and they were getting better and better. And they went to Fort Worth. Fort Worth was one of the big rodeos, and they decided that they would not compete if they didn't put their entry fees in to the purse. And they approached the people that were having the Fort Worth rodeo, and they said, "Oh, we couldn't do it. It's a community thing, and we don't have the money. We can't do it." Well, the money that they wanted put in was the entry fees, and they always kicked off the Fort Worth rodeo with the parade the first afternoon before the first performance at night. And so the people that had the rodeo put a sign up that says, "If you don't ride the parade, you don't get to be in the rodeo." And the cowboys all held their ground, and some cowgirls too. And they had signed a petition, and in 45 minutes, the streets were lined with kids and their parents and everybody waiting for that parade that always started the rodeo, and it didn't happen. And finally, they put the exact amount of money that they had got in entry fees into the purse. The minute they did that, the cowboys all got on their horses and the parade started. Well, their success was so great that they realized at that time, how can we go to every rodeo that we go to and do this? This isn't going to work. So some of the powers that be in rodeo, the big guns, the best dog riders, the best half ropers, steer wrestlers, all decided that when they got to Madison Square Garden, which was started in 1922, but this was 1936 is when they did it a year later. They were going to, behind closed doors, plan how to strike against, not strike, they didn't think of it as this, but they were going to demand that their entry fees be put on in at Boston, which was right after Madison Square Garden. Colonel W.T. Johnson from San Antonio was the biggest producer of rodeo at that time. He started in 28, and this was 1936. And behind closed doors, all the best cowboys were plotting, and they were there for almost a month. So they had plenty of time to get all their ducks in a row. And when they left Madison Square Garden and went to Boston Garden, there was about a 3-day lapse there. They put a petition together of 61 names of the top cowboys, and they presented this petition to Colonel Johnson, and he knew from years before, he'd been asked time and time again, and he wouldn't do it. He absolutely refused to put their entry fees into the purse. So the first night of the rodeo, they all walked out of the garden and said, "We're not going to compete." He put together anybody he could get, any young man that was bucking stalls in the back or janitor or whoever. He got him to get out there. In the meantime, he wrote to a rodeo in Chicago that was going on and saying, "If you guys will get here, I'll pay you an extra amount for coming and all." But the first night, the manager of the Boston Garden told Colonel Johnson that if he did not comply with those cowboys who were sitting up there and booing and getting all the other people in the spectators to boo, because the rodeo was just a complete failure, and that he'd never have another rodeo there. And so he agreed. They stopped the rodeo. They gave everybody their money back. In fact, Mark Clennon told me I got $20 back, and it only cost me $2 to get a ticket. But he paid everybody, and the next night the actual rodeo started. And a few days later, they formed the Cowboy Turtle Association, which they knew if they didn't form an organization, they were going to have to go to each and every rodeo to complain. And it was finally, they had this, and it took them a while. They never rushed it. They had the Fort Worth strike at Fort Worth in 35. realized that they needed to do it again, but do it at a place that was going to be the best place to do it and to strike against the best person. And of course, the best person was Colonel Johnson. And that's why they chose Madison Square Garden, because it was a very long rodeo by that time. In fact, the Madison Square Garden rodeos ended. It started as a 10-day affair in 1922, and it built up to 55 performances. So it was a huge rodeo. I have always called it the unofficial predecessor to the national finals.
Wow. Yes. I did not know that it had gone up to 55 days. I mean, obviously we see
55
performances.
Yes. Some of them could have been 2 in a day, but
Understood.
They were there almost, about a month at the most.
Yes. I mean, you don't see that too many places besides, I guess, the Fort Worth Stockyards and Mesquite, Texas. They have quite a few rodeos, but man, 55 performances is quite the feat for one place, especially a place where there's other events such as concerts and basketball games and other things going on. So that's interesting. And so from there, I mean, first of all, what does the Cowboys Turtle Association, where does that name come from?
Well, I think that they all joked about it and laughed and said, my gosh, we've been talking about this for years and years, and it's about time we got something done. And they said, what are we going to name it? And they named it the Cowboy Turtle Association. Nobody knows. I have questioned a lot of people, and a lot of people that are older than I am and that have had tried to find out, and nobody did. Willard Porter was a writer prior to my getting involved in all of this, and he had in a September 1986 Western Horseman, he had an article called the Cowboy Turtle Association. Slow but sure. So I think the turtle was what they ended up with. It only lasted 9 years, and after 9 years, I think they had gotten so much more professional, and the Turtles organization, being a Cowboy Turtle Association rodeo, meant a great deal. And in 1945, they changed the name of it to the Rodeo Cowboy Association, RCA.
And you were talking about how important it was to have that CTA designation for events. I know in the book you talked about specifically that there was a few rodeos in South Texas that occurred, and that was probably the first place that there was guaranteed money over $100. And I know that presenter or promoter said that he already offered $100 per event, but that was probably one of the first times that there was a CTA guarantee. Is that right?
Well, that's what the head guys that ended up being on the board. Rusty McGinty was the first president, but he didn't stay president very long. Everett Bowman was. Rusty said, "I've got a family. I've got to make a living. I can't do this. I can't be president. It's going to take too much of my time." And Everett Bowman then, but Rusty was the first one that they appointed. He was very much for everything they had done. He was there for the strike, for everything that brought them to that point of forming this organization, the Cowboy Turtles Association. But he resigned immediately, and Everett Bowman took over, and he was the president for the 9 years that it was the Cowboy Turtle Association. But I think they just got so much more professional and got so much better organized and everything, and they were well received. They weren't easily well received. There was a lot of conflict and a lot of problems, but they worked with the Rodeo Association of America that I mentioned earlier, of the businessmen, and they got along with some turmoil and some trials, but it all worked out. And by 1945, they wanted a more direct name of what it really was, the Rodeo Cowboy Association. and that's what they named it, and it stayed that up until 1975 when they put professional in front of it, and now it's the Professional Rodeo Cowboy Association, and it's the biggest and the best in the country.
And, what I find it really interesting that change happened in 1945. I mean, obviously, a lot of these cowboys were of fighting age and found themselves overseas, or at least in the service throughout the early 40s. Can you talk about those years? I know I want to go back and talk about Everett Bowman and the horns and hoofs, but if you wouldn't mind, I mean, what, did the World War have anything to do with that shift in 45 to a new name? I mean, were there men coming back in large numbers who were ready to get back to professional rodeos? I mean, what was the influence of that?
I think it had a tremendous amount. There were many cowboys that went to war. And in fact, some rodeos had to be shut down because they didn't have enough men to do it. But the president, Roosevelt, he encouraged rodeo because cowboys are very independent, but they're very patriotic. Very patriotic. And even today, the national flag is carried around the arena the very first thing, and we sing the national anthem, and everybody puts their hand on their heart. The guys all take their hats off. It's very important to cowboys, and so consequently, when they found out what was going on, they all jumped at it. And I will say that by this time, the Hoofs and Horns was a magazine that was out for rodeo. It started in Arizona as a dude ranch magazine, but it segued when Ma Hopkins came on to be just cowboy. They had some cowboy things in the magazine originally when it was for dude ranchers, but it ended up being strictly for rodeo cowboys. And Harry Rowell put on a rodeo in near Hayward, California, and he was quite wealthy, and he ended up buying subscriptions for every cowboy that went into the service, and they were sent overseas wherever they were, and there were numerous people that would write to Ma Hopkins, who was the editor of Hoofs and Horns, where they were and what they were doing and how much they appreciated her magazine. And it just, it was a very important part of the rodeo. And all those cowboys, even though they were patriotic and were going to take care of their country, they were anxious to get back and get back to rodeo.
And, I find it interesting, obviously today, my generation, we use social media, and there's newsletters that you can get instantly on your phone and whatnot. And this was kind of a prototype to that. I mean, the Hoofs and Horns seem to be a very great resource for your work, in the sense that a lot of the very important discussions, and it was kind of like the town hall of rodeo. Am I correct in assuming that? I mean, it seems like there was a lot of history that went down in those pages.
Oh, it definitely was. The only thing before it, outside of just newspaper reports or whatever, if they can be found, is, and you'll be surprised at this, is the billboard. Do you know what billboard was all about? Variety acts and the theater and Broadway and all of that. But they had a column in there in the 20s. I don't know how early it started, but in there called The Corral, and it was there was a fictitious name of the person that wrote it, but it was all about Wild West performers. And because rodeo didn't segue from Wild West, but they were some of those Wild West cowboys then got back to rodeo as soon as they could. They would have a lot of information, and I have been able to pull a lot of early day information out of billboard out of that one particular column in Billboard. So, but that was the only thing before, and Hoofs and Horns started in the early 30s, but it didn't become a totally rodeo magazine until the late 30s.
That's really interesting. I mean, it'd be pretty funny if Billboard came out with a top 100 cowboys every year, like they do everything else nowadays.
Well, it was. I mean, but it would be looking for you cowboys. Where is so and so these days?
Yeah.
So and so is going to be, But they started putting in a lot of the rodeo results in the Billboard in this column. So it was important back in those days, in the 20s especially. So.
Well, I think the one of the areas I also want to talk about was obviously Everett Bowman, and you said that McGinty was not able to do this because of having a family and whatnot, and you kind of go into it was a pretty tough life for Bowman and his wife. It sounds like when they were running the CTA. Am I right in saying that?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Everett Bowman and Hugh Bennett married sisters. And Hugh Bennett and his wife were the secretaries of the Cowboy Turtle Association in the beginning. And they operated it out of the back seat of their car. And so if you can imagine how membership was formed and all of that, there were only 3 membership and rule books that were printed for the Cowboy Turtle Association, and I have copies of all 3. And there are people that were turtles that never got their name in a membership book. And to this day, we have not found the very last list that was made up until the 15th of March when the Rodeo Cowboy Association. But I know Dude Smith, who passed away just a year or so ago. Jim Shoulders was a turtle. And what they did when Dude and Jim were just getting started, they were just, still wet behind the ears and rodeoing. And when they won any money at a turtle rodeo, they wouldn't pay them till they paid dues and became turtles. And so consequently, those 2. And we have just a few turtles that are left right now. There are just not many around. Bill Feddersen was a turtle, and but these fellas never got their name in any membership book. But the way they've explained how they had to become members, I know that they did that after writing that book and getting all the information that I did. So.
Well, that's certainly interesting. It's hard to imagine as we continue to lose more and more. I know my grandfather was in World War II, and he passed away about 5 years ago, and we're just losing, so many from that generation. And so I, again, really appreciate you not just, preserving the history, but also talking to these men that were there. And it's an important story, I think, because when you don't know the history is when you start, repeating it and start losing track of why the organization was founded. So I think it's a really important story. And along those lines, I know I didn't email you asking you to talk about this, but I was curious about your work with the Cowboy Heritage Museum and the recordings that you do for them, where you interview some of the old cowboys. I mean, how did that get started? And is that accessible to folks that are listening to this? Would they be able to listen to those interviews anywhere?
Oh, you're talking about the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, the Rodeo Historical Society.
Yes, ma'am.
Is an in-house organization that you can join separately from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, but it is housed there. And every year, their Rodeo Hall of Fame, which happens in November this year, they induct people, and that is an interesting story in itself, the Rodeo Historical Society's evolution. after the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum was formed in 1965. And that's when their building was built. They were formed a little bit before that. But anyway, I was a member of that. I joined everything I could join when I decided I was going to write this book on the history of the rodeo clown. And I joined the Rodeo Cowboy Association, PRCA. I became a member of it, called an associate member at that time. And I joined the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum and the Rodeo Historical Society. And I went to their activities and all, and that's where I got a couple of mentors. And one mentor in particular, his name was Charlie Beals, and he was a rough stock rider, started out, and then he married Imogene Veach, whose father, Monroe Veach, was a saddle maker, but he was also a trick rider, and he also put on rodeos. And Charlie and Imogene ended up having a saddle shop and he made saddles like Monroe did, but theirs was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the cowboys that went through Tulsa, Oklahoma always had to stop. But for some reason, Charlie saw in me at the first national finals I went to, I was asking him some questions, getting information for my book, and he introduced me and guided me and directed me. And because he was so well respected in the rodeo world, I think I have had a lot of extra benefits because he was the one that introduced me to people like Jim Shoulders and Harry Bold and people like that. And in the beginning, I was traveling all over the United States and getting information and talking to people. But when they put into the Rodeo Historical Society the very beginning of their oral histories, they've never done it before, but they admitted they were about 20 years too late. They should have been doing it. They put it in 2003, and at a meeting they had, I asked what happened to the oral history program, and the president, who happened to be Jimmy Gibbs Monroe, said, "Gail, that's a wonderful question. Would you be the chairman?" So I got the chairman of it because I was really excited about it with all the people I had interviewed by 2003. I thought I can add so much. Well, come to find out, their archivist at that time was trained at the Smithsonian and had all the right credentials, and he knew that an oral history has to be the person that you want their history. It has to be them talking. And so he was such a purist, and he trained me well, and I went all over the country with a little audio, to register these audio interviews. And but at the hall, we always did them on a video as well. And so now we have over about 300, almost 350 audio interviews of people that have been interviewed, that have been inducted there. And then I've made other special trips, and when I carried it with me and I'd run into somebody that I felt was important to get their story, I just stop and do it. And so it's been a good thing. And now I think the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame does it. I know the Pro Rodeo Hall of Fame, I started theirs with their interviews the first year they did it, and it's a great source. It's a great source of history, but it was started way too late,
Mm-hmm.
and should have been started, way back when. But that we didn't have those capabilities in those days.
Yes, man. Well, I think, like you said, it's a very important thing. And I always hear people talk about it. They said, we need to get so-and-so's story. And it's good to know that there are people like you and others that are capturing those stories for the next generation. And so that's why I wanted to kind of end this conversation on that, was that, what's the future of rodeo preservation look like? I think it looks like those types of interviews.
Well, I think that we've lost a lot of things that I'd sure like to know about. But for overall, I think I encourage everybody that wants to write anything. I don't have enough competition. I wish I did. I think, but it's time consuming. It's something that is so important. It's important to me. It has certainly sustained me and made me even more curious. In fact, I'm not just interested. I just about failed history in high school, and now I'm a walking history. Go figure. I don't think we ever know where we're going to end up, what we're going to do. But speaking of those oral histories, they are online with the Dickinson Research Center at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. And you can get any of that. That's the purpose of those oral histories, is for researchers, for historians, anybody who wants to get in there and hear those. They are welcome to come and get them. So.
Well, that is a great resource, and I will link that whenever I publish this. I'll put a link to their website in there. I know I've looked around on there before, and really appreciate that that's available to the to everyone online. But like I said at the beginning, your book, The Cowboys Turtle Association, is what really got me interested in interviewing you. But I know you have a few other books, and I hope that we can have future episodes where we can talk about those, because I do want to talk about the origin of the events. But do you mind quickly just listing what books you have available?
Okay, I have the first one, of course, I've already told you, is called Fearless Funny Men, The History of the Rodeo Clown.
Uh-huh.
And the second one I wrote, and that is the history of the rodeo clown. The second one is Belly Full of Bed Springs, The History of Bronc Riding, and that's the history of saddle bronc and bareback. And then I have Cowboy Up, The History of Bull Riding. Then I did Rope to Win, Rope to Win, The History of Steer, Calf, and Team Roping. And then I wrote The Cowboy Turtle Association, The Birth of Professional Rodeo. And then after that, I wrote a book called Western Women Who Dared to Be Different, and there are some rodeo women in it. It's not all rodeo, but it's women from the West who are really exceptional in my estimation. And my book on barrel racing is still at the publisher because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but I'm hoping it'll be out this fall. And I don't have a title on it yet, but and I'm presently working on a book that will probably not be published for a couple of years, and that is the history of the unofficial predecessor to the national finals, which is the rodeos at Madison Square Garden, Boston Garden, and London, England. And they go from 1922 through 1959. It's a big challenge, and I'm getting it done. So that's what's happening.
Well, that's great. And again, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. And to everyone listening, this is probably one of the best resources out there if you are interested in the history of rodeo and specifically the competitions. I mean, it's been a great help to me as I start down this journey of learning more about Western history. So thank you so much, Miss Woerner, for joining us today.
I'm Gail Woerner. Miss Woerner is not my name.
Okay.
Woerner. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Have a great. You've got a good podcast here, Austin.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I'm still here. Are you still on?
Yeah.
Okay. I just ended the recording, but I wanted to say. Giveaway for Miss Woerner's book, The Cowboys Turtle Association. Again, thank you so much for listening. I know that so many of you have been here since the beginning, and for all of you who are new, welcome. I look forward to continue to bringing more history and more information about the Western way of life. But until next time, Godspeed and God bless.